Gideon Tate stepped out of another one of those endless events, dressed in the dark suit that had become almost like a second skin. He moved through the crowd, barely registering the flashing cameras and murmured greetings. Somewhere along the line, these events had stopped meaning anything to him. But as a powerful Chicago businessman, he had an image to uphold. Cool, untouchable, the kind of man who never missed a beat. Tonight, though, something unexpected happened. As he crossed a brightly lit square in Seattle, where the event had taken place, he paused to catch his breath in the chilly evening air. And that's when he saw her, a woman with soft brown hair standing by a flower cart. She was holding a small bouquet of roses, and something about her made him freeze in place. Her face was the same as Rowena's, the woman he'd loved all those years ago, the woman who'd been taken from him far too soon. Gideon felt a strange sensation, like he'd somehow traveled back in time or was trapped in a strange dream. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. It was Rowena. It had to be. Without fully thinking it through, he took a step forward, and then another, until he was crossing the street toward her. As he got closer, he could see her features more clearly, and they were identical to Rowena's. But then, something shifted. She noticed him coming toward her, and her face twisted into a look of shock, maybe even fear. She took a half step back, clutching the flowers against her chest like he was some kind of threat. That reaction snapped him out of his daze, and he stopped, scrambling to find his words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softer than he intended. You look like someone I used to know." The woman gripped the flowers a little tighter, glancing at him with a wary, uncertain look. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as she replied, "I'm sorry, sir. You must have me confused with someone else." Her voice sounded a bit different than Rowena's had, maybe a bit lower, a little more tired, but there was a softness in her tone that felt familiar, something that hit him like a punch to the gut. Gideon took another shaky breath, fighting back a wave of emotions that had no place here. He looked at her closely, noticing faint lines around her eyes, an air of weariness that didn't fit the vibrant young woman he had once known. Could it really be her? Years ago, everyone had told him Rowena had died in a tragic accident. He'd tried to bury the memory, to force himself to believe it, to move on. But now, this woman stood before him, looking so much like Rowena. It was impossible not to wonder if he'd been wrong all along. She glanced around, clearly uneasy, and he suddenly realized he'd been blocking her way. He stepped aside, lifting his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. I'm sorry if I scared you," he said, offering a small, apologetic smile. She nodded quickly, muttered something under her breath, and then turned away, disappearing around the corner before he could fully process what was happening. And when she was gone, he found himself rooted to the spot, staring after her, feeling a familiar hollowness in his chest, one that he hadn't felt in over 2 decades. The night air felt even colder as he turned back, his thoughts swirling. He knew he could just walk away, tell himself he'd been mistaken, that it was just some crazy coincidence. But the feeling wouldn't let go. He knew what he'd seen. That woman was Rowena. There was no question in his mind. And if there was even the smallest chance she was still alive, if she'd somehow survived that accident all those years ago, he had to know. He couldn't let this go. He took a deep breath, ran a hand over his face, and pulled out his phone, dialing his assistant's number with urgency. "David, I need you to find some information for me on a woman in Seattle," he said, glancing back at the empty square. "Yes, I know it's not much to go on, but do your best." He ended the call and stood there a moment longer, staring at the street corner where she had vanished. Gideon Tate, the man with the unshakable reputation, felt strangely lost, surrounded by the city's lights and shadows. He turned slowly and started back toward his hotel, a new kind of emptiness settling over him, one he hadn't felt in a long time. As he walked, a flicker of hope began to form, even as his mind tried to rationalize it all as some desperate fantasy. But it didn't matter. That night, something long buried had come alive inside him again. The next morning, Gideon's mind was still spinning. He sat at the desk in his hotel room, gazing out the window, replaying every detail of last night's encounter. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random look-alike. That woman, Ivy, if he remembered the florist's stand name correctly, was his Rowena. He could feel it in his gut, when his assistant, David, called back with an update. Gideon snatched up the phone immediately. "I managed to dig up a little information," David said, sounding cautious. "The woman you're looking for, Ivy Carlson, has been working at that flower cart in the square for almost 3 years now. She lives in a modest apartment a few blocks away. Seems like she's kept a low profile. No criminal record, no online presence. It's like she's trying to stay under the radar." Gideon processed the information silently, his jaw clenched. The more he heard, the more convinced he became. If she really was Rowena, then her life had taken a drastic turn since the accident. But what could have happened to her? And why did she seem so wary? Almost like she didn't recognize him at all. "David, I need you to find out everything you can about her. Friends, family, any kind of history, and keep it discreet." "Yes, sir. I'll keep you updated." After ending the call, Gideon ran a hand over his face. It was as if the universe was playing some cruel joke on him, dangling a piece of his past in front of him, only to cover it with mystery. But he wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, especially one so personal. He made his way to the square, watching from a distance as Ivy went about her work, arranging flowers and chatting briefly with passing customers. From where he stood, she looked so much like Rowena. It hurt, but she also looked different. There was a heaviness in her posture, a caution in her movements. It was clear she was used to guarding herself, as if she was always on alert. For the next few days, Gideon kept coming back, watching quietly as Ivy moved through her routine. He bought flowers, exchanged polite words with her, each encounter leaving him both frustrated and intrigued. There was no flicker of recognition in her eyes, nothing that suggested she remembered him or their time together. And yet, in quiet moments, he'd catch her staring off into the distance, as if something just out of reach was tugging at her memory. On the 4th day, he couldn't take it any longer. He approached her cart once more, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and dread. She looked up, her eyes a bit wary but polite. "Back again?" she asked, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, I guess I can't resist the flowers," he replied, trying to keep his tone light. But inside, he was fighting to keep his emotions in check. "You must know all the people who come around here, huh?" She shrugged, glancing away. "I guess I do. Small square, same faces. People usually just come for the flowers, though." Gideon took a deep breath, feeling the weight of unasked questions pressing against his chest. "Do you ever, I don't know, feel like there's something you're missing? Like pieces of your life that just don't quite fit?" Ivy's gaze sharpened, her hand pausing over a bunch of roses. For a moment, she looked him straight in the eyes, and Gideon's heart skipped. But then, she broke eye contact, turning back to her work. "Everyone has parts of their life they'd rather not think about," she murmured, her voice tight. The response sent a chill down Gideon's spine. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him think she was hiding something, even if she didn't fully understand what. He needed to know more, and he was ready to push the limits to get his answers. Later that evening, David called again, his voice tinged with curiosity. "I don't have much, but I found one strange detail. Ivy doesn't have a family that I can find. No siblings, no parents. At least not that she's in contact with. There's no record of her before about 25 years ago." 25 years, Gideon echoed, a strange feeling prickling the back of his neck. That was around the same time Rowena had died. Could she have survived? Somehow lost her memory or been kept away all this time? His mind raced through the possibilities, each one more unbelievable than the last. "Yes, sir. No records of her before that. It's like she appeared out of nowhere." Gideon's jaw clenched, and he felt a surge of determination. He didn't care how long it took or how deep he had to dig. He was going to uncover the truth. He couldn't walk away from this. Not when he was this close. "Keep looking," he said, his voice low but firm. "If there's even the slightest chance if she's really Rowena, I need to know." The line was silent for a moment before David replied, "Understood, Mr. Tate. I'll keep you posted." After hanging up, Gideon sank into a chair, staring at the city lights outside his window. The world was moving on. But for him, time had stopped. He felt trapped between hope and despair, haunted by the image of the woman he'd loved and lost. A woman who might now be within his reach, but just out of his grasp over the next few days. Gideon's visits to Ivy's flower cart became part of his routine. Each day he felt a little closer, yet painfully aware of how much still separated them. He had glimpses of recognition from her, moments when she seemed to hesitate as if she was on the verge of remembering something, but just as quickly, those moments would pass, leaving him grasping at nothing. One morning, as he bought yet another bouquet, he leaned in a little closer. "Ivy," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "Have you ever felt like there's a part of your life that's missing?" She looked up, startled by the question, her gaze flickering with a hint of vulnerability. But then she forced a smile, shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice sounding forced. "I think my life is exactly as it should be." Gideon felt a pang of sadness at her answer, but he didn't push further. Not yet. He knew he had to be careful. Rushing her could scare her off, but patience was eating away at him. As he turned to leave, he heard her voice behind him, quiet but steady. "Thank you for always buying flowers." Gideon paused, surprised, and looked back at her. She was watching him, her eyes soft, and for the first time, he saw something familiar, something that stirred the embers of hope in his heart. "Of course," he replied, managing a faint smile. "Maybe someday you'll remember why." And with that, he left, feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was closer than he'd thought. In the days that followed, Gideon made it his mission to become a familiar, almost comforting presence in Ivy's routine. Every morning he would stop by her flower cart, buying small bouquets and exchanging friendly words with her, gradually softening the invisible wall that seemed to surround her. Sometimes he brought coffee, which she accepted with a shy smile. Other days, he'd show up with a simple breakfast pastry, claiming he bought too much for himself. Each time, he watched her expression soften, that initial guarded look slowly giving way to something more open. Yet there was still no spark of recognition, no hint that she remembered who he was, or the life they once shared. But Gideon didn't give up. He had always been a man of persistence. And this was one battle he couldn't walk away from. He knew the stakes. He was playing a delicate game, balancing his need to uncover the truth with the very real possibility that pushing too hard might scare her away for good. One day, as they shared a cup of coffee in the crisp morning air, he decided to take a gentle step forward. "So, Ivy," he started, keeping his tone casual, "you must have a pretty interesting story. Working in this square every day, meeting all kinds of people." She shrugged, giving him a small smile. "Not really. Most people just come and go. I'm just here. Just here," he repeated, chuckling softly. "I don't believe that for a second. Everyone has a story, you know." She looked away, her eyes settling on a distant point beyond the fountain at the center of the square. "I suppose," she said quietly, "but I don't think mine's all that interesting." Gideon's heart twisted as he watched her, seeing the shadow in her eyes that hinted at pain. He wanted to reach out, to tell her he remembered every detail of their past, but he held back. Instead, he leaned a little closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, it's not about the details," he said. "Sometimes it's about the things we feel, even if we don't fully understand them." Ever feel like that? Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of something. Confusion, maybe, or curiosity. But then she shook her head, her expression returning to its usual guardedness. "No," she replied, a little too quickly. "I don't think I have," he sighed inwardly, knowing he had to be patient. But each conversation, each tiny crack in her defenses, gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, he was helping her remember. As the days turned into weeks, he continued his careful approach, building a connection that felt both familiar and new. He never pushed, never rushed. But every day he let a little more of himself show, the man he'd once been with her, the man who still carried a piece of her in his heart. And little by little, he felt her warming to him. One evening, as they were closing up her flower cart together, he noticed her struggling to lift a box of supplies. Without thinking, he stepped forward and took it from her hands, surprised at how natural it felt to help her. "Let me take that," he said, grinning a little. "You don't need to strain yourself." She smiled, looking slightly embarrassed. "Thanks. I guess I've gotten used to doing everything on my own." The words stung, reminding him of all the years she'd spent alone, separated from him, struggling without even knowing why. But he forced a smile, keeping his voice light. "Well, you've got me now," he said, catching her gaze. "At least for the heavy lifting." For a moment, they stood there, looking at each other, and something unspoken passed between them. Gideon could see a question in her eyes, something hesitant but curious, as if she was on the verge of asking him something important. But just as quickly, she blinked and looked away, the moment slipping through his fingers. Still, it was progress. He could feel it. The next morning, he returned to the square with renewed determination. As he approached her cart, he noticed she was distracted, her gaze fixed on something far away, lost in thought. When she noticed him, she blinked and offered a faint smile, but he could see the tension in her posture. "Everything okay?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. She hesitated, then nodded. I don't know. I keep having these strange dreams lately." Gideon's pulse quickened. "Dreams?" he echoed, careful not to sound too eager. "What kind of dreams?" She looked down, fiddling with the edge of a petal from one of the roses. "It's hard to explain. Just flashes, really. Bits and pieces of places, faces. But they don't make sense, like, I don't even know if they're real." His heart pounded as he listened, knowing this was the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep his voice steady as he replied, "Sometimes dreams are just fragments of memories, you know. Maybe they're things you've forgotten." She looked up at him, her expression torn between curiosity and fear. "Do you really think that's possible?" "Yes," he said firmly, meeting her gaze. "I do." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air. Gideon could see her struggling, the conflict playing out on her face, and he knew he had to be careful. He couldn't risk pushing her too far, too fast, but he didn't want her to feel alone in this either. He wanted her to know that whatever she was facing, he was there for her, even if she didn't fully understand why. "Ivy," he said softly, reaching out to touch her arm. "Whatever these dreams mean, you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you." She looked down at his hand on her arm, her expression softening. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know why, but I feel like I can trust you." Those words sent a thrill through him, filling him with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he believed that they were truly making progress, that maybe she was beginning to remember. "Good," he said, letting his hand fall back to his side. "I'm not going anywhere." And as they stood there side by side in the quiet square, he felt something shift between them, a fragile bond, a hint of the connection they'd once shared. It wasn't everything he wanted, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The following days felt like a delicate dance, each encounter with Ivy bringing Gideon a little closer to the truth, yet keeping him just out of reach. His mornings had become a routine, stopping by her flower cart with coffee, sharing quiet conversations, and watching as her guard lowered bit by bit. Ivy was beginning to feel more comfortable with him, even sharing the occasional laugh, but today felt different. Ivy seemed distracted, her gaze distant as she arranged her flowers. Gideon noticed her glancing off into space, her hands moving absent-mindedly, as if she were somewhere else entirely. He approached, handing her the usual coffee. "Here's your favorite," he said, offering her a warm smile. "Thanks," she murmured, taking the cup with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You okay?" he asked gently, noticing the worry etched into her expression. She hesitated, then looked up at him, something unreadable in her eyes. "I've been having those dreams again," she admitted, almost as if she was confessing a secret. Gideon's heart skipped a beat. He leaned in, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Do you want to talk about them?" She glanced around as if making sure no one else could overhear. Then, with a slight nod, she gestured to a bench a few feet away. They walked over together, sitting side by side in the cool morning air. "I don't know how to explain it," she started, her hands wrapped tightly around the coffee cup. "It's like these flashes, like little pieces of a puzzle I can't put together. I see a man's face sometimes. I think he's smiling. There's this warmth, Like, I don't know. She shook her head, frustrated. And other times, I see a place. It feels familiar, but I have no idea where it is. Gideon swallowed, his throat tight. He wanted to tell her, to reveal everything, but he forced himself to stay quiet, letting her find her own way through the fog of her memories. "Do you remember anything specific?" he asked gently, fighting to keep the hope out of his voice. She frowned, her gaze distant. "It's all bits and pieces. I think I remember dancing maybe with that man, but every time I try to hold on to the memory, it just slips away. It's like chasing smoke." Gideon clenched his fist subtly, feeling both exhilarated and frustrated. She was remembering something. Even if it was hazy, even if it was incomplete, it was there. The life they'd shared was still somewhere inside her, just buried. "Maybe it's just a matter of time," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, memories come back when you least expect it. You can't force it." She looked over at him, her eyes searching his face, as if she sensed he knew more than he was letting on. "It's strange," she murmured. "Since you started coming here, it's like these memories are getting stronger. Like you're somehow connected to them." Gideon's pulse raced. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure how much he should say. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't lie to her either. "I think there's a reason for that," he said softly. "Maybe you're remembering things that were important to you. People who were important." Ivy's gaze held his, something flickering in her expression. She seemed on the verge of saying something, but instead she looked away, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I feel like I'm losing my mind," she muttered. "These dreams, these flashes, they make me feel like there's this whole other life that I've forgotten. But I can't make sense of any of it." Gideon's heart ached as he watched her, feeling the weight of her confusion. He wanted to reach out, to tell her everything, but he knew he had to let her take the lead. She was already on a fragile edge, and he couldn't risk pushing her over. "You're not losing your mind, Ivy," he said gently. "Sometimes, the mind protects us by hiding things we're not ready to remember. But when the time's right, those memories come back." She nodded slowly, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "I hope so," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Because right now, I don't know who I am." The words hit Gideon like a punch. He took a deep breath, reaching out and gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this. Whatever you're going through, I'm here to help. You can count on me." Ivy looked down at his hand on her shoulder, her lips curving into a faint, almost sad smile. "Thank you, Gideon. I don't know why, but I feel like I can trust you. Like we've met before." His chest tightened at her words. She was so close, so achingly close to the truth. He wanted to tell her they had met, that they had shared a life together, a love that had been ripped from them by tragedy, but he held back, letting her process her feelings in her own time. Over the next few days, Ivy's dreams continued, and each time she saw Gideon, she'd share fragments with him. Small, fleeting images of laughter, warmth, moments that sounded painfully familiar. Sometimes, she'd look at him with a hint of recognition, as if a memory was just on the edge of breaking through. One evening, as they closed up the flower cart, Ivy turned to him with a strange look on her face. "I saw the man's face again last night," she said quietly. "And he looked just like you." Gideon froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He struggled to keep his voice calm. "What do you think that means?" She shook her head, looking both frustrated and scared. "I don't know, it makes no sense, but there's this feeling I can't shake, like I'm supposed to know you, like we're connected somehow." He wanted to tell her then, to break the silence and lay out the truth, but he knew it wasn't time. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin. "Maybe it just means we're exactly where we're supposed to be," he said softly. "Maybe we're both finding our way back to something, or someone." She looked down at their joined hands, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I just wish I knew what it was," she whispered. Gideon squeezed her hand, his own eyes stinging with the weight of everything he wanted to say but couldn't. "I think you will, Ivy. Just give it time. Sometimes, the heart remembers things the mind can't." And as they stood there, hand in hand, Gideon felt a spark of hope. Ivy was remembering bit by bit. And maybe, just maybe, she'd remember everything that mattered. The next morning, Gideon woke up feeling an unshakable resolve. Ivy was starting to remember. He could see it in the way she looked at him, the hesitation in her voice, the distant look in her eyes as if she was reaching for memories just out of grasp. But he needed answers too. If there was any chance that Ivy really was Rowena, he had to uncover the truth about what happened 25 years ago. That afternoon, he called David, his assistant, whose research skills had been essential in his business. And now in his personal quest, when David answered, Gideon could hear the familiar sounds of tapping on a keyboard and a low hum of white noise, his usual work environment. "David, I need you to dig deeper," Gideon said, his tone serious. "Look for any records, any anomalies related to Rowena's death. Focus on any ties to my family, especially my father." David hesitated on the other end. "Your father, sir." "Yes," Gideon replied, his jaw tight. "If there's anything that might connect him to Rowena's accident or her disappearance, I need to know." There was a long silence before David responded. "Understood, Mr. Tate. I'll get back to you as soon as I find anything." The line clicked off, and Gideon exhaled, feeling the weight of this decision settle over him. The idea that his father could have played a role in Rowena's disappearance, or even her supposed death, felt like a betrayal of everything he thought he knew. But in his gut, he sensed something was off, that maybe Rowena hadn't just vanished by accident. Days passed with no word from David, and Gideon continued visiting Ivy every day, sharing coffee, light conversation, and, most importantly, companionship. Each morning he looked for signs of recognition, small hints that she might remember the life they'd shared, and every day, she seemed to draw a little closer, like a moth to a flame. One evening, as they closed up her flower cart, Ivy turned to him with a look of quiet determination. "Gideon, there's something I've been meaning to ask you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Go ahead," he replied, sensing the importance of her question. She looked down, her fingers nervously twisting a stray flower stem. "You seem familiar to me, more than familiar. It's like I know you somehow, but I can't remember why. It's been driving me crazy." Gideon's heart pounded as he took a step closer, his voice gentle. "Maybe there's a reason you feel that way. Maybe you're remembering things that were important to you. People who mattered." Ivy looked up at him, her gaze piercing. "But how would I know you? My life. It's been simple. I don't have a past full of people or places. I've lived in the same small circle for years, and yet, when I see you, it's like I'm seeing a ghost from a life I can't recall." He wanted to tell her everything, but he knew the time wasn't right. She needed to find her way back to him on her own, or the memories wouldn't feel real. Instead, he reached out, taking her hand in his. "Sometimes, life has a way of bringing us back to where we're supposed to be," he said softly, hoping the words would resonate. She looked at him, her expression softening, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. But then, her phone buzzed, breaking the moment, and she pulled away to check the message. Gideon took a step back, feeling the familiar ache of longing and frustration. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message from David. "I've found something. It's complicated. You're going to want to see this in person." An hour later, Gideon was sitting across from David in a quiet corner of the hotel bar, listening as his assistant explained what he had uncovered. 25 years ago, there was a police report that linked your father's company to Rowena's car accident. Nothing ever came of it, and the case was dismissed as a tragic accident, David said, handing over a file. But the timing and circumstances were strange. Witnesses reported seeing a second car at the scene, one registered to Tate Industries. Gideon's hands tightened around the file, anger simmering in his chest. "Are you telling me my father was involved in this?" "There's no direct evidence," David continued, his voice low. "But there were rumors that he disapproved of Rowena, that he saw her as a distraction to your future, and wanted her out of your life." Gideon's mind reeled. If this was true, then his father had destroyed the one person who meant everything to him, all to preserve the family's image, their legacy. The thought of Rowena suffering, of her life being torn apart because of his father's cold-hearted decisions, was almost too much to bear. He leaned back in his chair, swallowing hard, trying to process the information. He remembered the last time he'd seen Rowena, her smile, her laughter, and the way she'd looked at him as if he was her entire world. And then, she was gone, like a light extinguished. Gideon forced himself to focus, his voice low and deadly calm. "Thank you, David. I'll take it from here." David nodded, recognizing the gravity of Gideon's mood, and left him alone with the file. Gideon sat there for a long time, staring at the papers, feeling anger and betrayal twist inside him. He couldn't change the past, but he could confront his father, demand the truth, and more than anything, he could make sure Ivy knew what had happened, that she understood why her life had been torn apart. The next day, he arrived at her flower cart, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. Ivy looked up, her face lighting up as he approached, but Gideon could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. "You seem different today," she said, watching him carefully. He hesitated, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him, but he knew he couldn't hold back any longer. "Ivy," he began, his voice steady but intense. "There's something I need to tell you. Something you deserve to know." She looked at him, a mix of confusion and apprehension on her face. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, his heart racing as he prepared to reveal everything. "The reason I feel so familiar to you, the reason you feel like you know me, is because we have a past together. A life, a love, that was taken from us." Ivy's eyes widened, and she took a step back, looking at him as if he'd just spoken a language she couldn't understand. "What are you talking about? 25 years ago we were together," he continued, his voice soft but unwavering. "You weren't Ivy then. You were Rowena. We were in love. And then, one night, you were in an accident. Everyone told me you died, but you didn't. You survived, and somehow you became Ivy." She stared at him, her face pale, her hands trembling as she struggled to process his words. "No, that's impossible. I would remember that. I would know. I know it sounds impossible," he said, reaching out to touch her arm gently. "But deep down, I think you do remember. Maybe not everything, but pieces, fragments. That's why you've been having those dreams." Ivy shook her head, her expression filled with disbelief and fear. "If what you're saying is true, then why can't I remember any of it?" Gideon's heart ached as he looked at her, seeing the struggle in her eyes, the desperation to make sense of the past and the present colliding. Maybe because the truth was buried so deeply, maybe because it was too painful to remember. "But I'm here now, and I'll help you, Ivy. Rowena, we'll figure this out together." For a moment she looked at him, the walls around her heart crumbling as she reached out, letting him hold her hand. And in that moment, as they stood in the shadows of their shared past, Gideon knew that no matter what came next, he would do whatever it took to bring her fully back to him. The revelation hung heavily between them, a fragile bridge to a past that felt like a distant dream. Ivy's face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, as she tried to reconcile Gideon's words with the life she thought she knew. He watched her closely, holding her hand gently, afraid that at any moment she might pull away and retreat back into the guarded shell she had worn for years. She finally pulled her hand back, crossing her arms as if to protect herself. "Gideon, this is insane," she whispered. "You're saying I'm someone else, that my whole life has been a lie." He nodded, his gaze steady but soft, aware of how overwhelming this must be for her. "I know it's a lot to take in, and I know it sounds unbelievable, but think about the dreams you've been having, the flashes of memories. Those are pieces of your past, our past." She shook her head, taking a shaky breath. "But if that's true, then why don't I remember you? Why do I feel like a stranger in my own skin?" Gideon took a step closer, his voice low and calm. "I think you were made to forget. I think someone didn't want you to remember who you were, or the life we shared. They tried to erase everything that tied you to me." Ivy looked at him, pain flashing in her eyes. "But why? Why would someone do that?" He hesitated, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him. This was the hardest part, the piece of the puzzle that tied everything together, but also risked shattering her fragile sense of self. "It was my father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He thought you were a distraction, that you'd ruin my future. He didn't think you were suitable for the family. And he wanted you gone." She stared at him, the color draining from her face. "Your father, he's the reason I lost my life, my memories." Gideon nodded, his heart aching with every word. "He staged the accident. It was his way of removing you from my life. And for years, I thought you were gone, that I'd lost you forever. But somehow, you survived. You were hidden, made to forget." Ivy took a few shaky steps back, her hand pressed to her mouth as she struggled to process everything. Her whole body trembled as the realization sank in, that her entire life, her identity, had been stolen from her. All because of one man's ruthless determination. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything I thought I knew. It's all just a lie." Gideon reached out, his voice pleading. "I know it's hard to believe, but I'm here now, and I'll help you piece everything back together. You're not alone in this, Ivy. We'll get through it together." She looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. "But who am I, Gideon? Am I Ivy or Rowena? I don't even know who I am anymore." He stepped closer, taking her hands gently in his. "You're both. You're the woman I loved then, and you're the woman standing in front of me now. You may not remember everything, but I do. I remember the love we shared, the dreams we had, and I believe that, deep down, some part of you remembers too." She searched his face, her expression wavering between fear and a flicker of hope. For a moment, she looked as if she was about to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of denial. But then, slowly, she nodded, her hands tightening around his. "I don't know if I can believe all of this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I want to. There's a part of me that wants to trust you, to believe that this life I've known isn't all there is. I need time." Gideon nodded, relief flooding through him. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, every step of the way." They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken memories and shared pain filling the space between them. Ivy's gaze softened, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a stranger, but as someone who might hold the missing pieces of her soul. As the days passed, Ivy allowed Gideon to become a steady presence in her life. They met every morning, sharing coffee, quiet conversations, and pieces of her slowly resurfacing memories. She began to trust him, to open up about the fragmented images and emotions that haunted her dreams. Some days were filled with laughter, moments where they almost felt like the couple they had once been. Other days, she was distant, lost in her own thoughts, struggling with the weight of her rediscovered past. One afternoon, as they walked along the waterfront, Ivy glanced over at Gideon, her expression thoughtful. "I had another dream last night," she said softly. He looked at her, his heart pounding with anticipation. "What did you see?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "We were dancing. There was music playing, and you were holding me close. It felt so real, like I could almost reach out and touch it." Gideon felt a surge of emotion, remembering the nights they'd spent dancing, wrapped in each other's arms. He nodded, his voice gentle. "That wasn't a dream, Ivy. That was real. We used to dance together all the time." She looked away, her gaze distant, as if she was trying to hold on to the memory. It felt so familiar, so safe, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Gideon reached out, taking her hand in his. "You were. You always were." They walked in silence, their fingers intertwined, a comfortable warmth settling between them. Ivy's walls were slowly crumbling, her memories seeping through the cracks. Gideon could see it in the way she looked at him, the hesitant smile that played on her lips, the glimmer of recognition in her eyes. But there was still a long way to go. She was torn between two identities, struggling to reconcile her life as Ivy, with the fragments of Rowena that lingered in her mind. And as much as he wanted to, Gideon couldn't rush her journey. He had to let her find her way back to him in her own time. One evening, as they sat by her flower cart, Ivy turned to him with a hesitant smile. Do you think it's possible to start over, to find a new beginning, even with everything that's happened?" Gideon looked at her, his heart swelling with hope. I do. I believe that, no matter what's happened, there's always a way to start fresh. And if you're willing, we can find that beginning together. She nodded slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'd like that, I think. I think I'm ready to try. As they sat together in the quiet evening, the weight of their shared past and uncertain future settled around them. They were two people, bound by love and torn apart by forces beyond their control. But now, finally, they were finding their way back to each other. Gideon knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that they would face challenges he couldn't predict. But he was ready, and he knew that, with Ivy by his side, he could face anything. For the first time in 25 years, he felt a sense of peace. Days melted into weeks, and each day with Ivy felt like another layer of her memories peeling back, revealing glimpses of the woman she once was. Gideon could see it in the way she looked at him, with a softness and familiarity that hadn't been there before. Their connection was deepening, and even though she still struggled with the pieces of her fractured past, she no longer looked at him as a stranger. One crisp autumn afternoon, they decided to take a walk by the waterfront, the same place where they used to spend so many evenings together. The air was cool, filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the quiet hum of waves against the shore. Ivy walked beside him, her hand brushing his from time to time, a small but steady gesture of trust. As they strolled, Ivy turned to him with a pensive look. "Gideon," she began, her voice soft. "I've been remembering more. It's still fuzzy, but there are these moments when I see you, and it's like you've always been there." He looked at her, his heart pounding with a mixture of joy and anticipation. "Tell me what you remember," he said, his voice gentle. She took a deep breath, glancing out at the water. "Sometimes I see flashes, us laughing, dancing, talking about the future. It's strange because it feels so real, like I'm there, but then it slips away, like sand through my fingers." Gideon nodded, reaching out to gently take her hand in his. "Those memories, they're real, Ivy. Every one of them. We did share those moments. We dreamed of a future together, a life full of love and happiness." She looked down at their intertwined fingers, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I don't understand why it's so hard for me to remember it all. It's like there's something holding me back." He squeezed her hand, his voice full of quiet determination. "I think it's fear of everything you lost, and fear of facing what was taken from you. But I'm here, Ivy. You're not alone in this. I'll help you through every memory, every feeling that resurfaces. I won't let you go through this alone." She nodded slowly, and for a long moment, they walked in silence, their steps falling in sync as they moved through the quiet of the waterfront. Gideon could feel the tension in her, the unspoken questions and uncertainties that still haunted her, but he also sensed a growing strength in her, a willingness to confront the truth. No matter how painful it might be, that evening, as they were saying goodbye by her flower cart, Ivy turned to him with a shy but determined smile. Would you like to come over for dinner tomorrow?" she asked, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I don't have much to offer, but I'd like to spend more time together. Maybe it'll help me remember." Gideon's heart leapt, and he nodded, smiling back at her. "I'd love that." The following evening, Gideon arrived at Ivy's modest apartment, carrying a bottle of wine and feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. It was the first time in years that he'd been in such an intimate setting with her, and though she didn't fully remember their past, there was something comforting, almost nostalgic, about the atmosphere. Ivy greeted him with a warm smile, ushering him inside. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with plants and small touches that reflected her gentle personality as he looked around. He felt a pang of bittersweet emotion, realizing how different her life had become from the one they had once planned. "Make yourself at home," she said, taking the wine and heading to the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready." Gideon settled onto the couch, watching her move with a familiar grace, even though she was different now. There were parts of her, small gestures, quiet glances, that were unmistakably Rowena. They shared a simple but delicious meal, talking and laughing as if no time had passed between them. Ivy seemed relaxed, her guard down, and Gideon felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to feel the same connection that had once bound them so deeply. As they finished their meal, Ivy leaned back, looking at him thoughtfully. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," she said, her voice hesitant. "Anything," he replied, his gaze steady on hers. She took a deep breath, fidgeting with her napkin. "What were we like, back then, when we were together?" Gideon's heart swelled at the question. He thought back to their days as young lovers, how carefree and alive they had been, dreaming of a future together. He smiled, his voice soft and filled with nostalgia. "We were inseparable," he said, his eyes distant as he remembered. "You were the light in my life, Rowena. You had this way of making everything feel brighter. Like there was no problem we couldn't face as long as we were together." Ivy listened intently, her gaze locked on him, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She reached out, placing her hand over his, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Sometimes I feel like I know exactly what you're talking about. Like it's a memory I can almost touch." She looked down, her expression vulnerable. "But then it slips away, and I'm left wondering if I'm just imagining it." Gideon tightened his grip on her hand, his voice steady. "You're not imagining it. Ivy, those memories are real, and even if you don't remember every detail, they're a part of you. They always will be." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I want to believe that. I want to believe that there's more to my life than what I've known." "There is," he said softly. "And I'll be here, every step of the way, helping you find it." They sat together in the dim light, a comfortable silence settling over them. It was as if they were both suspended in time, caught between the echoes of their past and the possibilities of their future. Finally, Ivy leaned against him. Resting her head on his shoulder, Gideon's heart soared, and he wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. It felt so familiar, so natural, as if they were picking up exactly where they had left off all those years ago. "I feel safe with you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Like I don't have to be afraid." "You never have to be afraid with me," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I'll protect you, always." They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, as the world outside faded away, and for the first time in years, Gideon felt a sense of peace, as if they were finally finding their way back to the love that had been stolen from them. As the night grew darker, Ivy pulled back, looking up at him with a soft smile. "Thank you, Gideon, for everything." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's my honor, Ivy. You're worth every second of this journey." And as he left her apartment that night, his heart full of hope and a love that had survived so much, Gideon knew that they were closer than ever to reclaiming the life they had once dreamed of. A life that, against all odds, was slowly coming back into focus. The days that followed felt like a rebirth, as if Gideon and Ivy were rediscovering the beauty of their shared life piece by piece. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, their connection deepening as Ivy's memories became more vivid. She was beginning to open up, to trust Gideon fully, even as she struggled to reconcile her past with her present. But just as their lives seemed to settle into a rhythm, the weight of the secrets Gideon had uncovered about his father loomed larger. He had kept them from Ivy, knowing the truth could hurt her deeply, yet unable to deny the need to be transparent with her. She deserved to know everything, even if it was painful. One quiet evening, as they sat together by her flower cart after a long day, Gideon decided it was time. He turned to her, his gaze serious. "There's something I need to tell you, Ivy," he began, choosing his words carefully. "It's about the accident, the one that took your memories and changed everything." Ivy looked at him, confusion flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean? I thought it was just a tragic accident." Gideon's jaw tightened, his heart pounding as he struggled to find the courage to say what he knew would hurt them both. "It wasn't an accident. There's more to the story than you remember, and I need to tell you everything, even if it's difficult to hear." She went silent, her eyes fixed on him. Waiting, Gideon took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Ivy, Rowena, my father was the one responsible for that night. He orchestrated everything, trying to separate us. He didn't think you were good enough. He thought I needed to focus on the family business, to carry on the Tate name. He wanted you gone." Ivy's face went pale, and her hands tightened into fists. She looked away, her breath coming faster, struggling to process the betrayal. "Your father," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He destroyed my life. Our life." Gideon nodded, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. "Yes, I didn't know until recently, but I had to find out the truth. For us, I couldn't let him get away with it, Ivy. He stole everything from us, and I can't change what happened. But I swear to you, I'll never let him hurt you again." Ivy covered her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her whole body trembled as the truth sank in, as if her mind was struggling to make sense of it all. Gideon reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her expression twisted with pain. "All these years," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "I lived a life that wasn't mine. I lost everything, and it was all because he wanted control over you." Gideon's heart ached as he watched her struggle. Knowing he was powerless to erase the hurt, he wanted to take her pain away, to tell her it would be okay, but he knew that nothing he could say would make the betrayal easier to bear. "Ivy, I know this is overwhelming. I can't imagine the pain you must feel, but I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." She looked at him, her expression softening just slightly, though the pain was still there. "It's not your fault, Gideon. You didn't know, but it hurts, knowing that someone could be so cruel, that they could rip my life apart just to protect their own plans." Gideon nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm not like him, Ivy. I would never hurt you like that. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you, even if it means cutting ties with my family. I'll do it without a second thought if it means we can finally be free of their control." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her fingers trembling as she reached for his hand. "I believe you," she said softly. "I know you're different, and even though this is almost too much to bear, I want to move forward. I want to find a way to live a life that's really mine." Gideon felt a surge of relief, the warmth of her touch anchoring him in the moment. He knew this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where they could finally start to build something real. Free from the shadows of his family's past, they sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything between them a mixture of pain, hope, and resilience. Ivy's hand stayed in his, a quiet reminder that, despite everything, they were still together. They were stronger than the forces that had tried to keep them apart. The next day, Gideon made his decision. He would confront his father, lay everything out on the table, and make it clear that his loyalty was to Ivy and the life they wanted to build together. He couldn't keep pretending to be part of a family that had caused so much pain. He returned to Chicago, determined and resolute. His father's office was as imposing as ever, a place that once symbolized power and legacy, but now felt like a prison of deceit. Gideon stood tall, his voice unwavering as he faced his father. "I know what you did," he said, his tone steady. "I know you destroyed my life with Rowena, that you took her from me to protect your precious family name. I won't stand by you any longer. I choose her. I choose love, not the chains of this legacy." His father's face remained calm, unreadable. He adjusted his glasses, his voice cold. "You're throwing away everything we built for a woman. Think about what you're doing, Gideon. The Tate name means power, influence, and you would cast that aside for some memory." Gideon's jaw clenched, his voice firm. "She's not just a memory. She's everything I've ever wanted, everything that matters. I'll live without the Tate name if it means living with love and honesty." For the first time, his father's expression faltered, a hint of regret flashing across his features. But Gideon didn't waver, didn't look back. He turned and left, feeling a sense of liberation wash over him. He'd freed himself from the family legacy that had cost him everything, and he could finally look forward without the weight of the past. When Gideon returned to Seattle, he found Ivy waiting by her flower cart, her face softening when she saw him approach. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see the determination in his eyes, the calmness in his expression. "It's done," he said simply, taking her hands in his. "I chose you, Ivy. I chose us." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she wrapped her arms around him, resting her head on his chest. "Thank you, Gideon, for fighting for us, for never giving up on me." He held her close, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt free to love, to live, to build a future with the woman he had fought so hard to find again. As they stood together, Gideon felt a weight lift from his shoulders. There were no more secrets, no more shadows, just them, facing the world together. "I love you, Ivy," he murmured, his voice full of quiet certainty. "And I'm never letting you go again." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with warmth. "I love you too, Gideon, more than words can say." And as they walked away from the flower cart, hand in hand, Gideon knew that they were finally free to build the life they had always dreamed of. A life filled with love, trust, and the promise of a future they would shape together. Over the next few weeks, Gideon and Ivy's lives began to take on a new rhythm, one that felt almost too peaceful after the storm of revelations they had just endured. They spent quiet mornings together, Ivy's flower cart bustling with customers as Gideon lingered nearby, sharing coffee and conversation, growing more certain each day of the life they were building together. But beneath that peaceful surface, Gideon knew that there were still wounds to heal, both his and Ivy's. Ivy had lost 25 years of memories, and even though fragments had come back to her, there were parts of her past that remained out of reach. Gideon could see the pain in her eyes on days when she'd go silent, lost in thought, and he knew that no amount of reassurance could erase the scars left by his father's actions. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront, Ivy turned to him, her expression pensive. "Gideon," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking about everything we've gone through, about what happened all those years ago." He looked at her, his heart tightening. "What's on your mind?" "I feel like I need closure," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I need to understand why. Why someone would go so far to take everything from me, from us. I don't know if I can ever really move forward until I know." Gideon nodded, understanding her need to confront the past. He had severed ties with his father, but Ivy had never had a chance to face the man who had taken so much from her. She deserved that, and if it would help her find peace, he would do whatever it took to make it happen. "Then we'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "We'll confront him together. You don't have to do this alone." She looked at him, gratitude and apprehension in her eyes. "Are you sure? I don't want to drag you back into that world after everything you've done to leave it behind." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sure we'll face this together." A few days later, they traveled to Chicago. Gideon arranged a private meeting with his father, knowing that Ivy deserved answers and a chance to speak her truth. They arrived at his father's estate, an imposing mansion that felt cold and uninviting compared to the warmth and simplicity of Ivy's life. Gideon had grown up here, but now, the place felt alien, a relic of a life he no longer wanted any part of. When they entered his father's office, Gideon's father, Charles Tate, was waiting for them, his expression unreadable. He eyed Ivy with a mix of curiosity and disdain, as if he were looking at a distant memory he had hoped would remain buried forever. "So this is the woman who caused so much trouble all those years ago," Charles said, his tone cold. Ivy's gaze was steady, unflinching. "And you're the man who took my life from me," she replied, her voice firm, refusing to be intimidated. Charles raised an eyebrow, but there was no remorse in his expression, only a slight annoyance. "I did what was necessary. I protected my son from a mistake, from a life that would have ruined everything we built." Gideon clenched his fists, anger bubbling inside him, but Ivy placed a calming hand on his arm, signaling that she needed to handle this on her own. "You didn't protect him. You robbed him of happiness," she said, her voice unwavering. "You tore us apart because you thought I wasn't good enough. But love isn't about power or legacy. It's about the life and the joy you share with someone." Charles scoffed, his gaze hardening. "Love is an illusion. Power is real. Influence is real. And that's what I've spent my life teaching Gideon." I thought he understood that. Gideon shook his head, his voice cold. "I understand that you took everything from me. I understand that you thought you could manipulate my life to fit your idea of success. But I don't want your legacy. I don't want anything that comes with the Tate name if it means living without love, without honesty." Charles looked at them, his expression unchanged, as if their words meant nothing to him. "You're weak, both of you," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "Romantics, clinging to ideals that mean nothing in the real world." Ivy stepped forward, her voice calm but powerful. No, we're strong. We survived everything you threw at us, and we still found each other. We're choosing love, and that's something you'll never understand." For the first time, Charles seemed to falter, his eyes narrowing as he took in her words. But the moment passed quickly, and he returned to his stoic indifference. "If you're here for an apology, you're wasting your time. I did what was necessary, and I'd do it again." Gideon felt a wave of finality settle over him. He knew then that his father would never change, that the man who had raised him was incapable of understanding what truly mattered in life, and he felt a strange sense of relief, knowing he could finally close the door on this chapter. Without another word, Gideon took Ivy's hand, leading her out of the office. They left the estate behind, walking away from a legacy that had once defined his life, but now meant nothing. They were free, unburdened by the past and ready to create a future built on their own terms. Back in Seattle, a quiet peace settled between them. Ivy had found the closure she needed, and Gideon had severed the final ties to his family's toxic legacy. They were finally free to build the life they had dreamed of, one rooted in trust, honesty, and the love they had fought so hard to reclaim. One evening, as they sat together on Ivy's small balcony, watching the city lights flicker below, Gideon took her hand, his gaze steady. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, a soft smile playing on his lips. Ivy nodded, her eyes reflecting the warmth of his. "I never thought we'd get here, but I'm so grateful we did." He looked down, his heart swelling with gratitude. "There's one more thing we need to do." She raised an eyebrow, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "And what's that?" Gideon took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. Ivy's breath caught as she looked at him, her eyes widening with surprise and emotion. "Ivy, we lost so much time, but I want to spend every moment I have left making it up to you," he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "I want to build a life with you, a life where we don't have to hide, where we can be who we are, together. Will you marry me?" Tears shimmered in Ivy's eyes as she looked at him, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. She nodded, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "Yes, Gideon," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, their hands trembling as they held each other, overwhelmed by the joy of a second chance. They embraced, wrapped in the warmth of a love that had survived betrayal, tragedy, and the passing of time. And as they sat together, leaning into each other, Gideon knew that they had finally found their way back to where they were meant to be, together, with a future that was now entirely theirs to shape. The days following their engagement felt like a beautiful dream. Gideon and Ivy spent their time planning a simple but heartfelt ceremony, one that would celebrate their reunion and the journey they had traveled together. After everything they had faced, they wanted a day that felt personal, filled with love and the promise of a fresh start. One afternoon, as they walked through a quiet park, hand in hand, Ivy turned to him, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "Gideon, there's something I've been wanting to tell you," she said, her voice soft but serious. He looked at her, his heart thudding at the tone in her voice. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. Before I lost my memories, I think I was pregnant. I didn't realize it until recently, but lately, I've been having these flashes. Moments when I remember feeling a life growing inside me." Gideon stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding as he processed her words. "You mean, we had a child?" Ivy nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I think so. I don't know what happened after the accident, but I feel like I carried the baby to term. I must have somewhere out there. We may have a child we never knew." A surge of emotions hit Gideon. Shock, joy, confusion, and a powerful wave of hope. After all they had lost, the thought of a child, of a part of their love living on, was both overwhelming and beautiful. "Then we have to find them," he said, determination blazing in his eyes. "If there's a chance that our child is out there, we'll do whatever it takes to bring them into our lives." Ivy smiled through her tears, relief and hope blending together. "I was afraid to tell you. I didn't know if it was just another fractured memory, but Something inside me tells me it's real." He reached out, pulling her into his arms, holding her close. "Thank you for telling me. We'll find them, Ivy. I swear we will." And the search for their child became a new journey, one that reignited their sense of purpose. They hired a private investigator to search records from the years following Ivy's disappearance, looking for any clues about a child who might have been put up for adoption. Days turned into weeks, and the anticipation grew as each piece of information brought them closer to the truth. Finally, one crisp autumn morning, they received a call from the investigator. Gideon picked up, his heart racing as the investigator spoke. "I believe I've found something," the investigator said. "A young woman named Lila, 24 years old, born in the same year as your child would have been. She was adopted and grew up in an orphanage just outside the city. I believe she may be your daughter." Gideon's breath caught, and he quickly shared the news with Ivy, who clasped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Lila?" Ivy whispered, the name soft and reverent. "Our daughter." The meeting was arranged for the following day at a small cafe. Gideon and Ivy arrived early, nervous and filled with a mixture of joy and apprehension. When the door opened and a young woman stepped in, Gideon felt his breath catch. She had Ivy's gentle eyes with a hint of his own determination. She looked around the room, her gaze curious, until her eyes landed on them. Lila approached slowly, her steps hesitant. "Are you the people who wanted to meet me?" Gideon stood, his voice filled with emotion. "Yes, I'm Gideon, and this is Ivy, your mother." Lila's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth as she processed his words. Ivy stood, stepping forward slowly, her gaze filled with a mixture of hope and apology. "I know this must be overwhelming," Ivy said, her voice trembling. "We've only recently learned about you. I lost my memories after an accident. I didn't know you existed until now, but we would be honored if you'd let us get to know you." Lila's eyes softened, and after a long moment she nodded, her gaze flicking between them. "I don't know how I feel yet. This is a lot, but I'd like to hear more. I've wondered about my family my whole life." Gideon and Ivy exchanged a relieved smile, inviting Lila to sit with them. They shared their story, taking turns explaining the life they had once planned together, the tragedy that had torn them apart, and the long journey they had taken to find their way back to each other, and now, to her. As Lila listened, her expression softened, her gaze growing thoughtful. She asked questions, curious about their lives and the family she had never known, and by the end of their conversation, a fragile but real bond had begun to form. When they finally stood to say goodbye, Lila hesitated, then hugged Ivy tightly. Ivy held her, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Thank you for giving us this chance. I've missed you, even if I didn't know it until now." Lila pulled back, a small smile on her lips. "I'd like to keep getting to know you both. Maybe we can find a way to be a family." Gideon felt his heart swell with gratitude. "We'd like nothing more, Lila." In the weeks that followed, Lila became a part of their lives, visiting frequently, joining them for dinners, and sharing stories about her childhood. Ivy and Gideon found joy in getting to know their daughter, in seeing the blend of their personalities in her, and in realizing that despite everything, love had found a way to unite them as a family. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Ivy looked at Gideon, her eyes full of contentment. "This is what I dreamed of," she murmured, her gaze flicking to Lila, who was laughing at one of Gideon's jokes. "A family. I thought it was lost, but somehow we found our way back." Gideon reached for her hand, his heart full. "It's more than I ever could have hoped for." Lila looked at them, a warm smile on her face. "Thank you for finding me, for giving me a chance to know where I come from." They shared a quiet, heartfelt moment, the love between them as strong as the years they had lost. It was a second chance, a gift they would cherish forever. As they sat together, Gideon knew they had finally reached the ending they had once dreamed of, an ending that, despite all the pain and separation, had led them back to each other and to the family they had always wanted. And in that moment, they knew they were home. The days and weeks that followed felt like a quiet miracle. Gideon, Ivy, and Lila had formed a family, not one free of scars or history, but one built on trust. honesty, and the unwavering love that had survived despite all odds. They spent time together in ways that felt simple yet precious. Lazy Sunday mornings with coffee, cooking dinners together, and sharing stories late into the night. Each moment felt like a victory over the past, a testament to the strength of what they'd built. One autumn afternoon, Gideon suggested a small gathering to formally celebrate their reunion and their new life together. They planned a simple but heartfelt ceremony in the park near Ivy's flower cart, where so much of their journey had come full circle. Friends, some of Ivy's regular customers, and a few of Gideon's closest colleagues gathered, filling the air with laughter, warm smiles, and the scent of fresh flowers Ivy had carefully arranged. As they exchanged vows, Gideon's heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that they had fought so hard for this moment. The vows were simple, honest words that spoke of second chances and promises to never let go of each other again. After the ceremony, they celebrated under a golden sky as the sun dipped low, the warmth of the day giving way to a cool, quiet evening. Lila stood beside her parents, her face alight with happiness, watching her mother and father finally come together in the way they'd always dreamed of when the guests had left. Gideon, Ivy, and Lila remained in the park, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by the soft glow of string lights. They talked long into the night, sharing their hopes, dreams, and plans for the future. The following week, as they settled into the new rhythm of their lives, Lila approached Ivy with an idea. "I've been thinking," Lila began, "about everything you went through, how much you fought to find your way back, how love somehow found its way through. I think it's a story that should be shared." Ivy tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Lila smiled, her eyes bright with determination. "Let's open a small flower shop together. Somewhere people can come not just for flowers, but for hope, for second chances. We can call it the Second Bloom." Gideon chuckled, a warm pride filling his chest as he looked at his daughter. "That's a beautiful idea." Ivy's eyes filled with emotion. "A flower shop, dedicated to new beginnings." She nodded, her smile softening. "I love it." And so, they worked together to bring Lila's vision to life. They found a cozy spot in the heart of the city, and soon, the space was transformed into a vibrant, welcoming shop filled with fresh blooms, hand-picked arrangements, and touches of warmth and love in every corner. Ivy and Lila worked side by side, creating bouquets that felt like little gifts of hope, while Gideon handled the business side of things, bringing his expertise to help the shop grow. The Second Bloom became a cherished spot in the community, a place where customers came not just for flowers, but for comfort and inspiration. People would often linger, captivated by the warmth that filled the air, by Ivy's gentle smiles and Lila's laughter. In time, the shop became a place where couples proposed, friends shared secrets, and strangers found comfort in the beauty of something as simple as a flower. One day, as Ivy and Gideon stood outside the shop watching Lila arrange a display in the window, Ivy turned to him, her eyes soft. "I never imagined we'd end up here," she said. "After everything, it feels almost unreal." Gideon smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes, the best things in life come after the hardest journeys." She rested her head against his shoulder, a soft sigh escaping her. "Thank you, Gideon, for never giving up on me, on us." He kissed the top of her head, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I'd search the world 1,000 times over to find you. Nothing could ever make me stop loving you." They stood there, side by side, watching as Lila waved at them from the window, her smile a mirror of the love they had fought so hard to reclaim. Years passed, and the Second Bloom continued to thrive, its reputation growing as a place of kindness, resilience, and love. Ivy, Gideon, and Lila built a life that was rich not in wealth, but in connection, surrounded by friends and community members who had become like family. On a sunny day one spring, Ivy glanced out the shop window to see a couple holding hands as they browsed through the flowers. She watched them, smiling at how love and hope could still bloom, even in the simplest of moments. Lila appeared beside her, nudging her playfully. "You see that look in their eyes? That's how you and Dad look at each other." Ivy laughed, a warm, contented sound that filled the shop. "I guess some things never change." Gideon joined them, placing a gentle hand on Ivy's back as he smiled at the couple outside. Love finds a way, he murmured, his voice filled with quiet pride. And as they stood there, watching life unfold in all its beauty, they knew that against all odds, they had found their way back to each other, to the family they had dreamed of, to the life they had always deserved. Together, they had created something lasting, something true. They had found not just each other, but a future rich with love, hope, and the promise of new beginnings. And that was the most beautiful bloom of all.